And I was reading a quote by British physicist Paul Davies in your article. Obviously, he's very, very famous, well known, uh, about how true it is that first we determine, as I was thinking about this as I was reading that article, first we determine our paradigms and then our paradigms determine us. In other words, we only see what our paradigms allow us to see. And I think perhaps that explains why Davies, although a very, very brilliant guy, can say that mindless, blundering atoms have conspired to make not just life, not just mind, but make understanding. So his predispositions happen to prohibit him from seriously considering the alternative of intelligence. And so we have to re-examine our paradigms, and I think this is one of the arguments we have to make when we're talking to people in general. You have to examine your paradigm because your paradigm only allows you to see what your paradigm allows you to see. So you're not thinking about your paradigm, you're thinking with your paradigm.
Yes, that's exactly right. The committed naturalist won't, to use the famous quote, allow a divine foot in the door. As far as they're concerned, supernaturalism or theism in general is completely out of the question, and therefore, no matter what kind of observations are made about the material world, they will not even consider the realm of possibilities that include the existence of God or supernatural power. So they rule it out a priori before even looking at the evidence. So I guess a good way to think of it is they're limiting the size of their intellectual toolbox rather than saying, well, let's take an honest look at things and see how things are pointing. Are the findings of science pointing beyond themselves to a higher explanation, or are they not? But if you're ruling out the very possibility, then that's a question you don't even get to ask in the first place.
Yeah, I love the even-handedness of your approach because you've also pointed out that there are atheist philosophers, Thomas Nagel comes to mind, who is willing to bite the bullet and admit that his rejection of theistic explanations of the world are based entirely on prejudice. I mean, he famously said, I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. So he is biting the bullet. He's recognizing that his predisposition against God is based on a philosophical prejudice as opposed to a scientific argument.
Yes, precisely. So he is one of the very few that I can say are quite honest in their evaluation of the situation we find ourselves in from a cosmic perspective. His book, Mind and Cosmos, is an outstanding example of this, where he talks about the grave insufficiency of Darwinian naturalism to explain what we observe in the world. And so that book has been a huge boon to the project of Christian apologetics because he makes such great arguments, and he's making them from the perspective of an atheist. But just like you say, he isn't willing to go all the way to theism, and he is honest about the fact that that's because of his philosophical pre-commitments. He prefers instead to speculate about some as-yet-to-be-discovered principle behind the universe that makes it tend towards increasing complexity and rationality.
I would imagine that it is comforting for someone like yourself to be free to consider the reality of a personal cosmic mind as the explanation for the exquisite three-part harmony that you've codified in your article, mathematics, human mind, the material world, as opposed to being forced to accept the mindless alternative.
It is. It's so much more intellectually satisfying because under the naturalistic paradigm, you're just left with this set of brute facts that have no explanation and will not ever have an explanation because these essentially are not questions that can be answered with additional scientific research. At bottom, they're metaphysical questions about our scientific observation. So the naturalist is just stuck in this rut of meaninglessness and lack of full explanation, whereas the person open to theism has this whole other spectrum of options to pull from. And we are free to say, wow, it seems very much as if mind, rather than blind matter and energy, is the fundamental truth behind the universe.
I want to talk a little bit about your new book, Science and the Mind of the Maker, subtitled What the Conversation Between Faith and Science Reveals About God. In that book, you have a moniker. It's called the Maker Thesis. What does that explain?
Okay, so I hint very strongly to the Maker Thesis in the article that just came out in CRJ, A Grand Cosmic Resonance. So the idea behind the Maker Thesis is that the enormous success of the scientific enterprise that we have watched unlock many of nature's secrets strongly implies the existence of a maker. And not only does it strongly imply the existence of a maker, but it implies one who desires to share some of his mind with the creatures. And we would say that because we're made in his image is the reason we are able to share in his mind. So from what we observe, it looks very much as if one of the main goals of the development of the natural world was the existence of rational beings who could investigate its deep structure. And as we investigate the deep structure, we thereby understand something of the mind that seems to be behind it all. Turns out that there are features of the universe in general, and then there are features of planet Earth in particular that make man's home incredibly hospitable to the scientific enterprise. And to go along with that, we have the kind of minds that are suited to carry out that kind of investigation. And this coincides very well with the Christian doctrine we mentioned earlier of the Imago Dei, the idea that mankind is not just a creation, he is the crown of creation, made in the image of God. And as such, we're endowed with these cognitive faculties that allow us to have not just moral awareness, but also higher rationality. So I think using the word resonance, as I do in the CRJ article, is perfect for describing this crazy situation we find ourselves in. There was a 4th century Alexandrian bishop named Athanasius, Saint Athanasius, and he's one of my absolute favorite Christian saints. I love reading his work. And he used this analogy that always comes to my mind when I'm thinking about the cosmic resonance behind the Maker Thesis. He said, like a musician who has tuned his lyre and by the artistic blending of low and high and medium tones produces a single melody, so the wisdom of God, holding the universe like a lyre, adapting things heavenly to things earthly, and earthly things to heavenly, harmonizes them all, and leading them by his will makes one world and one world order in beauty and harmony. And I just love that. I think it's so appropriate to the thesis of my book that when we observe the world and we observe our own nature, we see this incredible resonance that leads us to understand that there is a maker whose mind we are able to tap into just a little bit when we carry out the natural sciences. And then, of course, we see these ideas communicated in both the Old and New Testament. Psalm 19 is a famous one where we read that the heavens declare the glory of God and they send a message to all the earth. And then in Romans 1:20, St. Paul tells us that God's power and wisdom are so clearly seen in what has been made that mankind is without excuse when it comes to knowing and worshiping him, the creator of all things. And so in the book that I have coming out, what I've tried to do is weave together this glorious intellectual history with the most up-to-date findings of science and the most up-to-date progress in philosophy, and show how these very ancient arguments have not been debunked by the rise of modern science. They've, in fact, been truly vindicated by modern science.
As you were speaking, I was thinking about a quote that I saw in your book, and I actually used it as the quote of the day in the Bible Answer Man broadcast. It was from one of my heroes, Cicero, first century BC. And the reason he's one of my heroes is I used to teach memory for years and years and years, and he was a memory expert, and he laid out some of the principles of mnemonics before the time of Christ. But the quote in your book, "What can be so obvious and clear," said Cicero, "as we gaze up at the sky and observe the heavenly bodies, as that there is some divine power of surpassing intelligence by which they are ordered." Here you have an ancient pagan philosopher recognizing intelligence in creation. Here's a myth that needs to be exploded. The idea that as our understanding of nature has grown, warrant for theistic explanations is shrinking. That's a myth. It's a myth that needs to be exploded.
Oh, it absolutely is. And it's interesting to be in conversation with those that try to promote that myth, because very often they're just using talking points learned on the internet or talking points they've learned from pop atheist literature, and they've never thought about it deeply, and they've never considered the breadth of the knowledge and the breadth of the contributions that the Christian worldview has made to things like the scientific enterprise, for example. So you're exactly right. It's a myth that needs to be dispelled.
Now, you just put your finger on something that I want you to explore a little bit with me, and that is the whole idea of thinking. We no longer think. We pick up bits of information and parrot that information. I'm speaking in a general sense, of course. We parrot that information as opposed to thinking deeply. And part of that is the staccato nature of our culture. I mean, we're getting information at such a rapid pace that we never really get a chance to digest it. I mean, I watch television shows all the time. The interviews are increasingly short. You're coming up to a station break, and then you're on to something else. And because of that rapid fire, people don't get a chance to really think or ponder these very significant issues. So what do you do about that? What do you do as you are working to teach your children or other people? How do you teach them to actually process information, to think deeply about things in an age in which we are being bombarded with information but not really processing it?